Okay, hello and welcome to a very important lecture where we will be discussing an overview of respiratory physiology. And in addition to that, we will talk about very important laws, the law of Boyle, Boyle's law, and Charles' law, Henry's law, Dalton's law, in addition to Fick's law and Young-Laplace law. These are very important laws, and understanding of them is highly imperative to having a deep understanding of respiratory physiology. The first thing we need to know is that in the dynamics of breathing, fluids in general, whether we're talking about a gas or a liquid, fluids will never flow except from an area of a higher pressure to an area of a lower pressure. We have seen this in the heart, where blood would flow from the atria. When the atria contract, when the atria are depolarized, they would contract, and that signifies high pressure, and then the blood would flow through those valves because the valves are now relaxed. Why are the valves open and relaxed? Because the pressure in the atria is very high. So the pressure is high, causing the movement of the blood to flow smoothly from the atria into the ventricles. Later on, when the ventricles depolarize, now the ventricles will become an area of a high pressure, and that would cause the blood to flow from the ventricles through the semilunar valves. We would see this concept here also in breathing, although we're not dealing with liquid like the blood, we're dealing with a gas. Same thing. When we inspire, when we take a deep breath, taking a deep breath means that the air flew from the atmosphere into the lungs. So that means in order for inspiration to take place, air has to flow from an area of a high pressure to an area of a low pressure. So if air flew in from the atmosphere into my lungs, that means the atmosphere has high pressure and my lungs have the low pressure. And the opposite, when it comes to exhaling, when we exhale, that means air flew out from my lungs into the atmosphere. That means the pressure within my lungs has to be more than the pressure of the atmosphere in order for the air to flow out. So that means my body is responsible for anatomical rearrangements that would cause a disparity or a change in pressure. So that means in order for the air to flow from the atmosphere into my lungs, that means my body must do anatomical rearrangements, and these anatomical rearrangements with my rib cage and my diaphragm will add up to making my lungs an area of a lower pressure in order for air to flow in. And if I want to exhale, that means some anatomical rearrangements concerning my diaphragm and concerning my intercostal muscles. Some anatomical rearrangements must happen that would make the inside, my lungs, to be an area of a high pressure so that air could flow out. And we will talk about that in detail. What we also need to know is that there are two types of respiration: external respiration and internal respiration. External respiration and internal respiration. What is the difference between external respiration and internal respiration? External respiration refers to the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide with the atmosphere. So the lung, in a sense, is just an airport of gases. That's why when there are pathologies such as emphysema and such as many pulmonary diseases like pulmonary fibrosis, we see that although the air is successfully in the lungs, it doesn't mean that it will make its way to the blood circulation, and it also does not mean the oxygen and the carbon dioxide would flow out to the environment. So that shows you that this lung is an airport. It's an airport that has oxygen, and it is able to provide oxygen to the blood circulation in perfusion, and would uptake carbon dioxide in order to vent it out to the atmosphere. That is a healthy lung, a functioning airport. In clinical unfortunate conditions, we would have situations where oxygen is sequestered in the lung and is unable to make its way to the blood circulation. And also, carbon dioxide could be sequestered in the lungs but is obstructed and unable to make its way out of the lungs, as in the case with COPD. So, the main concern we need to know is that this is your respiratory system. Respiratory system is concerned with homeostasis of gases and pH. We need an adequate homeostatic amount of oxygen. And in the body, there is a metabolic waste. Why do we need oxygen? Because oxygen is important for oxidative phosphorylation. That's why they call it oxidative phosphorylation. Oxygen is the final electron acceptor in your mitochondria, and it is very important for the generation of ATP. Now, if there is no oxygen, that means the body will try to perform first aid or compensatory mechanisms in order to survive and shift from aerobic respiration into anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is only good enough for a short amount of time to save your life, but you cannot rely on it for survival. You can just rely on it in your way to the emergency room, in you while you are on your way for other medical urgent interventions, but you cannot rely on anaerobic respiration. So that's why oxygen is important. And when we use oxygen, the metabolic waste and the metabolic byproduct is carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide must leave the body. If carbon dioxide stays in your circulatory system, that would cause a drop in the pH, and that would lead to acidosis. That would lead to a very dangerous condition of high pH. So you understand there is homeostasis of the pH. The pH must not leave the range of 7.35 up to 7.45. Okay, it cannot be more acidic than that, and it cannot be more basic than that. If there is more carbon dioxide, you rest assured that the pH will drop and you will have acidemia, and there will be so much acid in your body, and that would become a stressful, noxious stimuli that would put your life in danger. So, the first thing we need to understand is that there is external respiration, external respiration. And the external respiration refers to the exchange of gases between the lungs and the atmosphere. We are receiving oxygen in the lungs and we are venting and exhaling carbon dioxide. That's external respiration. The other important thing that we also need to know is that there is also internal respiration. What does internal respiration mean? Internal respiration means after the external respiration successfully happened, we have received our oxygen and it is now in our lungs. We need to now carry that oxygen from the lungs into the blood circulation, and the blood circulation, the circulatory system will deliver it to the tissues, and then the tissues will take the oxygen and will give off the carbon dioxide. Those tissues who accepted the oxygen would send that oxygen to the mitochondria for oxidative phosphorylation. And that is your cellular respiration or internal respiration. You must understand the difference between external respiration and internal respiration. External respiration meaning exchange of gases between the atmosphere and the lung, and internal respiration means exchange of gases between your lungs and the tissues of the body. You must also understand that when I say gases, I mean both oxygen and carbon dioxide. When it comes to homeostasis, there is a range for both. We do not remove 100% of the carbon dioxide, nor do we take 100% amount of oxygen. There is a conserved amount of oxygen that must be in your body. Less amount than that or more amount than that would translate into a stressful, noxious stimuli that would cause cell injury. or if there is a lot more carbon dioxide than we need, or a lot less carbon dioxide than we need, then that would also translate into noxious, stressful stimuli. If there is so much carbon dioxide in the blood, that would cause acidosis. If there is very little carbon dioxide in the blood, that would lead to alkalosis. You know that the respiratory system is a tract. We have these tracts everywhere in our bodies. We have reproductive system tract. We have a reproductive tract. We have a urinary tract. We also have digestive tract, and we also have respiratory tract. The respiratory tract anatomically is divided into an upper respiratory system and a lower respiratory system. The upper respiratory system begins with the mouth and your oropharynx, and also your nose, your nasopharynx, your oropharynx, and your laryngopharynx, and then you would go into the trachea, which is circular, surrounded with cartilage to ensure that it remains circular. If it wasn't for that cartilage, if it wasn't for this cartilage surrounding your trachea, the trachea would collapse and it would be obstructed. The cartilage is what keeps it like a tube and maintains that is there's an ability for the flow of by both ways of oxygen going in and carbon dioxide going out. Okay, you must also understand that although we have an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory, the lower respiratory tract begins from the trachea and below, and you have your bronchioles and the terminal bronchioles, and then you have your alveoli. So the upper respiratory tract, that's an anatomical classification, an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. But when it comes to the functional classification, you have a conductive respiratory system with your nose, your nasopharynx, your laryngopharynx, your oropharynx, laryngopharynx, the trachea. These just conduct, meaning they pass. They pass the oxygen, they brush all of the oxygen, remove, they have a lot of immune cells that would, trap any debris, or fight any microbes that are trying to make their ways with into the body with the air. They also filter the air, moisten the air. So these are conductive organs in your respiratory system. But there is another classification, and that is the respiratory anatomical classification. So your respiratory system is either, every organ in your respiratory system is trying to serve one of two functions: either conduct and pass the oxygen, filter it, purify it, moisten it, and the other function is to actually perform the respiration or the exchange of gas between the alveoli, or known as the perfusion, to perfuse the blood with oxygen and remove the carbon dioxide. And that is the job of your alveoli. So everything else besides the alveoli is part of your conductive respiratory system: your oropharynx, your nasopharynx, your laryngopharynx, your trachea, your bronchioles, except the alveoli. They are the most important units of your respiratory system, and what they do is they are very important. They are very important because they perform the gas. They perform the gas exchange, and that is known as the respiration. Respiration. So respiratory segment and a conductive segment. Okay, so we know that we breathe through the trachea, and these are the alveoli, and the alveoli would perform the exchange right here. They would supply oxygen and they would remove carbon dioxide and then send it out to the body. Okay, so you know that there are two circulations: the systemic circulation, which provides the systems of the body with oxygen, and it takes the carbon dioxide and metabolic waste and sends it back to the right heart to pump it back to the lung. So you have a pulmonary circulation, and you also have a systemic circulation where there is a systemic tissue exchange of oxygen between your circulatory system and the cells in order to undergo the oxidative phosphorylation. Oxidative phosphorylation. Okay, so I alluded in the past to the concept of the pressure the concept of pressure, the concept of fluids never moving from one area to another area, except that when the pressure is higher in one area and lower in the other area. So you need a gradient. That is, you need a pressure gradient. So in order to create that pressure gradient, that means the muscles and your respiratory system must undergo conformational anatomical changes that would translate into making pressure differences with the atmosphere. So the atmospheric pressure is constant, 760 millimeters of mercury. If I want to inhale, what happens is those muscles, the intercostal muscles, and my diaphragm, I need to make arrangements. I need to make arrangements that are longitudinal arrangements and vertical arrangements. So vertically, the diagram would take care of that. So when it comes to inspiration, when we inspire oxygen, what happens is the diaphragm would contract, meaning it would move down, contracting the contraction of the diaphragm, meaning it will move down. So when the diaphragm has moved down, what happens to the volume of my respiratory system? If the diaphragm was up here, but now it expanded, it went down. What happens to the volume? The volume has increased. Long vertically. Longitudinally, I have transverse diameter. I have these intercostal muscles that they would pull my ribs upward and outward. And that would cause like a barrel chest. So now my chest would expand horizontally. So now this expansion, so now not only did I expand vertically, I expand horizontally. So now definitely the volume of my respiratory system got much bigger. So when the volume of my respiratory system got much bigger, what happens to the pressure? You must understand that at a constant temperature, the relationship between the pressure and the volume is always inverse. At a constant temperature, the relationship between pressure and volume is inverse. Meaning if I increase the volume, the pressure decrease. If I if I decrease the volume, pressure increases. And that is your Boyle's law. So Boyle's law says if I have a conserved number of gas molecules in two containers and I keep the temperature the same, so the temperature is not changing, so I can only move this piston down in order to make the volume decrease or move the piston up to make the volume increase. So let's look at the initial situation. I have a conserved known number of gas molecules flowing and contacting, striking the walls of the container. And that is how I measure my pressure. So now these gas molecules, let's say I have 100 of them, 100 or 1,000 gas molecules of one known gas, and they are just running around in a constant temperature, and they're just striking the walls of the container. And I measured the pressure, and it was that much. If I do conserve the temperature, but I push the piston down, so now the volume was this big, it was very big, and now the volume went down. I crush the volume down, I push the piston down, and then the volume is less. What happens now to the pressure? The pressure would increase as seen here. So the pressure went up. Why? Because when the temperature is conserved, the gas molecules would apply a particular pressure to the walls of the container, and if I increase the volume, the pressure would drop even more, and if I decrease the volume, the pressure would increase even more. And that is your Boyle's law. And this is exactly what's happening with your respiration. So in order for me to inhale, in order for air to come in from the atmosphere into my lungs, I must follow Boyle's principle, and that is to make the volume Oh, because the temperature is constant. The atmospheric temperature is constant, and the temperature of my body, the homeostatic temperature is conserved. That's why there is homeostasis, because we maintain the temperature of the body. So the temperature is constant. What happens is when I'm inspiring, what happens is the diaphragm is contracted, so it moves down. So longitudinally or vertically, I have increased the volume. In addition to that, my rib cage moved upward and outward, anterior posterior expansion. So now there is a transverse diameter increase in my chest. So now my rib cage is moved. These muscles are contracting. These inspiratory muscles are contracting in order to widen and broaden and make bigger my rib cage, and that would increase the volume. So when I increase the volume, what happened to the pressure? Pressure dropped. So now, like a waterfall, the gases will start flowing from the outside, from the atmospheric temperature, from the atmospheric from the atmosphere into my lungs. Vice versa. Let's say I want to exhale. What I want to exhale, and now I gotta do the opposite. In order for me to exhale and gases to leave my lungs, I must do the opposite. I must do anatomical rearrangements that would make the pressure inside even more than 760, so that air could flow out. And what happens is now, if for inspiration the diaphragm move down, that means for expiration it has to move up. So now I relax my diaphragm, and I shorten and make smaller my vertical space in my respiratory system. And the intercostal muscles are also, the expiratory muscles are going to contract in order to compress and make smaller my rib cage, and the transverse diameter of my respiratory system will get smaller, and now I have such a very small volume in my respiratory system, and that would cause a very decrease the volume, increase the pressure. So now I have a high pressure in my respiratory system, and that would cause the oxygen, and that would cause the air to flow out from an area of a high pressure to an area of a lower pressure. Okay, so now this was Boyle's law. You conserve the temperature. If you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure. So if you increase the volume, the pressure would decrease even more. And if you decrease the volume, you push the piston down, the pressure would go up. And that is your Boyle's law. What about Charles' law? Charles' law says that temperature, if temperature changes, so now the law is PV equals nRT. So if the volume is constant, the pressure would have a direct relationship with the temperature, and vice versa. If the volume is constant, the pressure would have a direct relationship with the temperature. And if the pressure is constant, the volume would have a direct relationship with the pressure. So let's look at what's happening here. What's happening in Charles' law is, let's say I conserve the pressure. So the pressure is the same. But what I do is I keep the pressure constant. So the pressure is constant. The pressure is not changing. But I increase the temperature. So the temperature went up from here to here, went up this much. So if I increase the temperature, what happened to my volume? My volume was up to here before I increased it. When the temperature was here, the volume was here, and the pressure is constant. Here, the pressure is still constant. But when the temperature went up, what happened to the volume? The volume moved up. So that shows you there is a direct relationship between volume and temperature, if and only if pressure is constant. And you would see the opposite is also true. If I keep the volume constant, if I keep the volume constant, I don't change it, but I change the temperature, you will see that the volume would also would also increase. And if I make the volume constant. I don't change the volume, but I increase the temperature, the pressure would increase. If I decrease the temperature, the pressure would decrease if the volume is constant, and vice versa. If the pressure is constant, if temperature increase, volume increase. Temperature decrease, volume decrease. If pressure is constant, and if the volume is constant, temperature increase, pressure would increase. Temperature decrease, pressure would decrease if and only if the volume is constant. So that was Charles' law. Now let's look at Dalton's law. Dalton's law is very interesting. Dalton's law is the law of partial pressures, meaning it's like you're having a salad of gases. If you make a salad, you have two tomatoes, and you have one lettuce, and you have one piece of onion, and you mix them all together. You will see that what you brought in, okay, this is the law of ideal gases, meaning that there are properties you must understand about the ideal gases. What do the ideal gases do? Ideal gases are gases that do not contact with each other. That's the first priority of an ideal gas. If they ask you on the exam, what makes an ideal gas ideal? Your answer should be an ideal gas is a gas that is ideal because it does not contact with other gases. It just has contact with the container, with the walls of the container. So that's an ideal gas. A gas behaving in its best behavior, not contacting other gases, but only contacting the walls and just giving us pressure. So now all the pressure that we have and we measure from the walls of the container is the pressure that exerted by all the gases. The second thing you need to know, let's say, in the atmosphere, what are the gases in the atmosphere? There are about 78% of the gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen. Nitrogen. So if there are 100 molecules of gas in the atmosphere, you bet that 78 of them are nitrogen. 78% of the atmospheric gases are nitrogen, and 21% of the atmospheric remaining gases is oxygen, and the one remaining percent is just all the other gases. So it's very interesting. If 78% of atmospheric gases are nitrogen, and if the oxygen is 21%, if you mix 78 molecules of nitrogen with 21 molecules of oxygen, and you bring in, let's say, 1% that is divided into these carbon dioxide and these other molecules. If you put it in a container, you would see that the pressure would translate to the fraction. So for example, your nitrogen is 78%. So your atmospheric gases are 70% nitrogen. That means 78% of the atmospheric pressure is caused by nitrogen. 28% of atmospheric pressure is caused by oxygen. So if you multiply 28% by 760 degrees, that will give you the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. 78% multiplied by 760 atmospheric pressure, that will give you the partial pressure of your nitrogen in the atmosphere. So now this is what is shown here. Let's say blue represents let's say I have an experiment, and in a container I have three different containers. The first container has one molecule, and it has this much. This one molecule is exerting this amount of pressure. And in the other container, you have this second molecule that is exerting this amount of pressure on the wall of its container. And then you have this third molecule that is exerting this amount of pressure on the walls of its container. If you mix the three of them up here, you have your salad. You rest assured that the total pressure on the walls of this new container that is hosting and harboring these three different gas molecules would be equal. So would equal the fraction. So for example, this was how much this molecule was exerting on the walls of its container, it will translate to exactly that same amount. This much was the amount of pressure exerted by the molecules of this container, then you rest assured that it would translate to that same amount in this new big salad, in this new mixture of your contain in this new mixture. And then this would have, so the total pressure will be the sum of those pressures. So the partial pressure of molecule one, okay, plus the partial pressure of molecule 2 and the partial pressure of molecule 3, the three of them when added will give you the total pressure of this container. Okay, and lastly we have Henry's law. Henry's law would tell you, it is very similar to Dalton's law, which is the law of partial pressures. But here it tells you that if you're dealing with gases and liquids, you will see that if you have 78% of nitrogen in the air and 21% oxygen, and you bring a glass full of water and you put it, then you look into this glass and you count of all the gases dissolved inside this water, what is the percentage of nitrogen? You would see that it is also 78%. It's 78% in the air, 78% in water. 28% oxygen in the air, you will see it as 21% oxygen in the water. And this could be different sized beakers. You have a 1 liter beaker, 2 liter beaker, half a liter beaker, 0.25 milliliters beaker, 100 milliliters beaker. You can have an entire container of water. It doesn't matter. If you look into all of them, you would see that the partial pressure of the oxygen in the air would translate into the amount of oxygen that is dissolved into the container. And the last thing that I want you to understand is that this movement, this anatomical rearrangement that your body must undergo, it is done by your nervous system. There is neuroscience. These muscles are obviously highly vascularized. Your intercostal muscles are highly vascularized with circulation. With they are perfused with oxygen and nutrients, and there are also veins that would take the metabolic waste and carbon dioxide and remove it. And they are also, in addition to being highly vascularized, these muscles, they are also highly innervated with nerves. And why are they highly innervated with nerves? So the action potentials could come, and they are the ones responsible for compressing, like contracting these muscles. What makes the diaphragm contract in inspiration? It is your nervous system. What makes your intercostal muscles contract during the intercostal muscles, the inspiratory intercostal muscles? What makes them contract in inspiration? It is your nervous system. It is also your nervous system that is responsible for their relaxation. Your nervous system is responsible for the contraction of expiratory muscles, okay, when they contract during the times of expiration. So you must understand that these anatomical rearrangements, the contraction of the diaphragm, the widening of your transverse diameter, the increase in the transverse diameter, the intercostal muscles, this is regulated by your nervous system. So we have a medullary center. Okay, so what happens is there is a respiratory control center. This respiratory control center, there is a feedback mechanism. In the feedback mechanism, what happens is we have a sensors in the aortic arch. In the aortic arch, we have sensors, and um, in your carotid sinuses and your aortic arch, you have sensors that would sense how much carbon dioxide is there. Do you see? Is the blood getting more acidic? You have peripheral chemoreceptors. You also have central chemoreceptors. Central chemoreceptors are very important for detecting carbon dioxide fluctuations, because carbon dioxide, you have the blood-brain barrier. So in the blood-brain barrier, the carbon dioxide would if it increases so much, it would start to diffuse from your circulation. It would cross the blood-brain barrier and it would enter your brain, and that's how they are detected with these central chemoreceptors. So you must understand that there is a homeostatic regulation. Okay, that if your the carbon dioxide increases, it will be sensed. First of all, there would be an input signal, an input sensory signal that would send stimulation to your medullary center, saying that there is so much carbon dioxide, please increase the rate of breathing. So now it would send output extra potentials to your muscles and to your diaphragm, and would make it more rapid, make the breathing more rapid. Why? Because we have chemoreceptors that are peripheral to discuss changes and fluctuations in carbon dioxide and pH, and also we have central chemoreceptors. They would detect that we need to modulate and modify our rate of breathing. Okay, and if we have restored our carbon dioxide, we have restored our carbon dioxide level to its homeostatic range, that we no longer need to be breathing as don't need to be hyperventilating or breathing as fast as we should. So what ends up happening, inhibitory signals would go to your medullary center, and that would cause your rate of breathing to drop, your rate of breathing to drop. uh, Also, we must also be concerned with okay. What we also need to talk about is this very important concept of Young-Laplace law. So Young-Laplace law is very important in that it is the law of the importance of surfactants. So you have to understand that water molecules attract each other. You have H2O, you have oxygen and two hydrogens. So there is an electric dipole. So what happens is that negative charge on the oxygen would react with the positive charge of the hydrogen atoms of the other water molecules. So they would start contracting. They would start, and that would cause a collapse of the alveoli. That's how we solve this problem with surfactants. So Young-Laplace law says that these surfactants are important in reducing that water attraction forces, that dipole, that the electronegative force between those water molecules in the alveoli that would cause the alveoli ultimately to collapse. So the surfactant would come and it would inhibit and hinder each water molecule from attracting the other water molecule, because like I said, oxygen has a negative charge, H2O, two hydrogens positive and one oxygen negative. So if you have so many H2Os, what happens is every oxygen would be attracted to the hydrogens of the other water molecule. So you would have such a network and tight attraction of the water molecules, causing the alveoli to collapse. What happens is the surfactant would come in and would conserve each water molecule and prevent its oxygen negatively charged from being interacting with other with other hydrogen molecules that are positive. It would limit these attractive forces, and that's how we would maintain our alveoli. So what happens, what young Laplace law says, is that these alveoli, they're not the same size. Some alveoli are smaller than the other. So the smaller the alveoli, meaning the smaller the volume, that means the pressure is higher. So that means air would flow from an area of a higher pressure to an area of a lower pressure. What young Laplace law says is that there is a disparity in the amount of surfactant. Do you think that the larger alveoli would have the same amount of surfactant as the smaller alveoli? Of course not. So the smaller alveoli would have a lot more surfactant, and the larger alveoli would have surfactant, but not as much. But in the end, everything will add up to the homeostatic movement of oxygen that is in equilibrium. So you wouldn't have so much surfactant in the smaller alveoli or so much surfactant on the larger one. You would have a lot more surfactant in the smaller alveoli in a way that makes it equal to the amount of in order to allow for the air and the air to flow, this fluid to flow from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. The last law I want to talk to you about regarding gases is the Fick's law. Fick's law just says that there are four dimensions that regulate the movement of gases, and the first one is your if there's a diffusion, if there's a diffusion membrane. So the first important factor is the surface area. The higher the surface area, the more gas exchange you would have. That's why we have a lot of alveoli. So the more surface area, the more, so there's a direct proportional relationship. The more surface area, the more gas exchange, the more gas diffusion. So the direct relationship between surface area and gas diffusion. The second important dimension would be the solubility. So if a molecule is more soluble than another molecule, then it would diffuse better and more than the other molecule. So the more soluble we make the molecule, that means the faster and the more of it will diffuse through the membrane. And another dimension is the thickness is inversely proportional. So the thicker the diffusion membrane, the slower and the more difficult it is for the diffusion to happen. And the last dimension is the partial pressure. The higher the partial pressure, the more diffusion would happen. So we have three direct relationships, and that is the partial pressure and the surface area and your solubility. So those three would enhance the rate of diffusion through the diffusion membrane, except one that is inversely proportional, that is the thickness of your membrane. This is a very important concept, and we will talk more about it to make it more clear. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.